Welcome to Great Loop Radio, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA. Today, my guest is Bill Parlatore, and we are discussing some of the things that, particularly if you're new to boating and looking for your Great Loop boat, some of the things that it would be great for you to know at the very basic level before setting out. And these are some of the things that maybe you wouldn't necessarily learn immediately in some of your boating classes. So really kind of some tips to be successful on the waterway and to be courteous and have the proper etiquette when you're boating. So I will bring in Bill in just a moment, but like I always do, I want to recognize and thank our Admiral level sponsors who support AGLCA. They are Curtis Stokes and Associates, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and our viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. And another business that supports the Great Loop is Seattle Yachts, and I want to introduce Bill Parlatore. Bill, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate your time today. And a lot of our listeners probably have heard your name before or seen your name in print, but just give us a little bit of the background of yourself and your experience in the boating industry.
Well, I think most people that know me associate me with being the founder of Passage Maker magazine, which we started back in the mid '90s, and eventually started an event business called Trawler Port, and then we bought Trawler Fest, and it just sort of became this big thing for a long time, and it was certainly captured my imagination, and it gave me an opportunity to travel pretty much around the world. So I've been able to do some pretty incredible stuff, which is kind of sad now because a lot of people can't go to some of the places right now with COVID and some of the other things going on. Before we did Passage Maker, I was a sailor before really we got into trawlers, and I've been sailing really since the '70s when I started in Seattle. So since then, with the magazine, I've been on the board of directors of ABYC, the standards organization, as well as the Safety at Sea Committee at the Naval Academy. So I've been around, and I know a lot of the people in the industry, and it's certainly turned over a lot. But it's great to see how many new people are coming into boating, partially because of COVID.
Right. And it'll be nice when people can start to cruise to some of those far off places again. And I think we're getting there. And we've got several loopers at least making the crossing to the Bahamas shortly. Some are already there, in fact. So hopefully we can get some more longer distance cruising in. And so you wrote this piece. It was called Getting Ready for the Great Loop. And you wrote that under kind of the Seattle Yachts banner. So tell us a little bit about, Seattle Yachts and what made you decide to write this piece about getting ready for the Great Loop.
Well, I've noticed that it seems like every 10 years we get a new generation of people coming into to do cruising, to get into boating. And they're asking the same questions that people did 10 years ago. And I've been talking to people that are planning to leave in April and in May, and it just seemed like they're not really super experienced with boating, and they're not sure what the questions are to ask. So it seemed like, why don't we just kind of cover some of them and get people thinking?
Yeah, and I think that's spot on, particularly because even for our newer members or people that are just starting out on the loop that do have a lot of a boating experience, a lot of that is on a lake. And there are some different things that are happening out there on the ICW. And in my cruise from Charleston down here to Fort Myers a few months ago, I did notice some of the things that you were mentioning that people really should understand and know how to do before they get started on the Great Loop. So let's kind of jump in. You talk in your article, and I will make sure that everyone, there will be a link to the article itself in the description on the video and on the podcast version so that you can take a look at that. But you kind of talk about this, this idea that's a little bit different than traditional cruising of, so for some, the Great Loop really being kind of a bucket list item, and that kind of changes things in terms of the cruising style a little bit. So talk about that phenomenon and how doing the Great Loop as a bucket list kind of differs from somebody who's going to be out there cruising for, all of their retirement years.
It's very interesting to talk to brokers who are working with couples, and they're usually couples who are looking to do the Great Loop. And I don't know how they necessarily heard about it, but this is something that they've decided, I have to do this. But they're not necessarily boaters. They don't necessarily have boating experience, and the boat is really not that focused to them. Unlike normal cruising people who, excuse me, my dog is rolling over on my foot,
No problem.
who who wind up lusting after the boat. These people are traveling, they're not so much cruising. And so the boat they're looking for is going to be not the top of the line. They want something that's easy to wash and keep clean and not have a lot of maintenance issues. So they want a simpler boat. I think in the article I said a Chevy versus a Cadillac, and that's because it's not about the boat to them. It's about the experience of going and doing the loop.
Yeah, and that I liked that analogy because, as most of our listeners and viewers know, we're proponents of doing the loop in whatever way is joyful and meaningful to you. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. But it is true, Bill. Back in your years at Passage Maker and at the initial start of America's Great Loop Cruisers Association, it was much more typical for people doing the loop to have been long-term cruisers. Frankly, nobody else knew that the loop existed. So there has been that change and that shift. And I think a lot of it is social media just kind of spreads the word a little bit more so about things like the Great Loop. So we do have a lot of members that are newer to boating, and they're absolutely, of course, welcome. But there's also something to be said about the Chevy versus Cadillac analogy. If you are looking to buy a boat, do the loop, and then sell the boat. And it's a very different, I think, boat buying strategy if that's your master plan, is only to hold the boat, for a year or 2 years or something along that line. So talk about, kind of the resale portion of that equation if you're not going to be a long-term boater.
I know brokers that have sold the same boat 4 times to different couples who are going to go do the same thing. And it's almost like the boat's done the loop 4 times or 5 times or whatever. And that's just very, very different. We talk about that's the value of your organization, is to be a resource for people to maybe go and ask questions and to find out, and especially to meet other people that are going to do this too. And I remember back, long time ago, we had a guy named Pete Kopchak who came and talked about doing the loop. And he spent 4 years preparing his Hatteras LRC to do the trip. And he was laughing, and he said it was so stupid because we had this boat that was overqualified. We had all this canned food that we didn't use. We didn't use any of the parts. And he said, we were in Ohio, not up the Amazon River. And so that we made it into a bigger deal than it needs to be. And I think that's also something that's important to get the message out, to not overcomplicate and overstress the boat.
Right. And that's, I think, one of the reasons you mentioned a broker that that, and there are several of them out there who have sold a boat repeatedly to different couples for the loop. And I think that's part of, the peace of mind for somebody that's newer to this, is it's clearly a proven vessel at that point for the Great Loop. And boats like to move. So if it's just coming off the loop and has performed well on its way around, it's kind of a great time for somebody else to jump into that boat and take it around. And again, the Chevy versus Cadillac kind of ideas, there's a bigger market for the resale on, kind of the Chevy of boats than there would be on the Cadillac of boats.
It's going to be a boat with 1 engine or 2, but that's not really important. But it won't have a lot of varnished teak. It won't be anything on the outside. It'll be just stainless steel and white fiberglass, or whatever color the hull is. And that's normally not an attractive thing, but for doing this trip for those kind of people, it's perfect.
Yes,
because when they sell the boat, whatever the difference in money is the cost of the adventure.
Exactly. And in the past few years, there have been several boats as the prices have gone through the roof that bought the right boat that there would be a market for when they finished, and actually made some money on the deal. And that is not going to always happen, especially now with prices being so high. At some point, the bottom may fall out on some of those boats, and as long as folks are willing to take it, it's worrisome to watch somebody buy a boat at an increased price right now, knowing that they may not get the value back out of that. But there's also the price of the adventure, and it's hard to beat that if you kind of figure that boat cost, as you said, Bill, into that adventure.
If that's on your bucket list, it's worth paying for.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the best part about this is in the process of doing the loop, a lot of the people realize they're meeting new people. They're having such a good time. They don't want to sell the boat, and they want to go to the Bahamas, and they want to start doing other cruising. And I think that's the really good thing that hopefully will happen for more and more people.
I think that's a spot on, because that is happening more and more, that people are just falling in love with the lifestyle and wanting to continue it. And for some of those people, they continue with that Great Loop boat. And for some, after having been aboard for a year or 2 years, realize that, yes, this is what they want long term, but realize there's maybe a different boat that they would like if they're going to be a true go all in, live aboard, and continue to cruise. So we do see that too. Some people who thought they'd sell, hold on to the boat, and other people go ahead with that sale, but then purchase something else that they're going to continue to cruise on, whether it just be more of the Great Loop waters or heading over to the Bahamas. But one of the things you stress, Bill, in your article is the importance of learning the rules of the road. And I think there's an impression, since there's in most states, no licensing needed to drive a boat. Everybody learns the rules of the road, the actual road for cars. But many of us grew up boating on lakes where the rules really, and I hate to say it this way because it sounds dangerous, but in certain environments, the rules aren't as important. If you're on an enclosed lake without a lot of boat traffic. So you may have a lot of boating experience, but may not truly know the rules of the road. So whether you're experienced or not, it's something you should have a refresher on. So what are some good resources for people to really find out and learn and refresh on the rules of the road for boating?
Well, thankfully, yeah, Boat US is a big resource. You have the Powerboat Squadron that has online courses. You have YouTube videos. It's been covered so many different places. It's very easy to pick up even the free pamphlet that the government prints and just kind of look at it and just kind of think about it, that it is like passing in a car, but there are times when it isn't. And that's where you need to know how to be able to communicate from, if you're especially in the ICW that you just went down from Charleston. There are times when you need to get in front of somebody who's going really slow, and you need to be able to communicate to them so that you can arrange to have a safe passing of that vessel. And you could do that either with hand signals or the radio or the horn.
And I really want to spend some time on that, because it sounds like a simple concept, the concept of a slow pass, but there is a right and a wrong way to do it. And in addition to, seeing enough of the right and the wrong way in my own cruising, I also get reports all of the time, and it always makes me cringe, of, hey, this boat waked me today and they were flying that Great Loop Burgee and they need to learn the rules of the road. So, I would like to think that in most of those circumstances, it is, a mistake or sheer ignorance of how to do a slow pass. Because, like I said, nothing really makes me cringe more than when a looper is complaining about being waked on a pass by another looper. So let's talk through that. What is the proper way to do a slow pass?
An ideal situation would be two trawlers going along. One's going a little slower. The one behind that's coming up behind him wants to arrange a slow pass, and to either call them on the radio and just ask for a slow pass. In the best situation, the boat that's in front will slow down just a bit so that the boat that's passing him won't have to be throwing a big wake to get by him. If he's plodding along at 7 knots and slows down to 5 for like 10, 20 seconds, that's enough time for the boat to get past him without having a lot of wake. In some cases, the boat that's being overtaken, if it's a stabilized boat, he might just say, just go ahead because I have fin stabilizers and I'm not going to be affected. But that's really the ideal pass. You're both communicating. It's not just you signaling and hoping that he's hearing you, but he's responding or she's responding back. So you're having a conversation.
So you're absolutely right. The communication is really the key there. Um, So does does that procedure change any if you're meeting as opposed to overtaking another boat?
It's the same signals.
Mhm.
You don't necessarily you communicate with the same signals. In the case of commercial traffic, they probably won't be using hand signals. They'd use the radio, but it's the same basic thing. Get out of his way and just be as safe as possible. But if you're in places like the rock pile in Myrtle Beach, you really can't go around somebody.
Mhm.
So you just have to kind of settle in. If if you give him the boat in front of you, the horn signal, and they don't respond, and you try to call them on the radio, that's made a lot worse. I think I mentioned in the article, if the person in front has their dinghy covering the name of the boat, which you see that's like a mortal sin, and I think that you shouldn't get the burgee for the Great Loop Association until you prove that you have the name of your dinghy, the name of your boat on the bottom of your dinghy, because
Yeah.
that makes it very, very frustrating. And there's really no nice way to do that, to do a pass that way.
Yes. And I would like to add to that having the name someplace visible. I am seeing so many more creative, almost logoed boat names with some really
Mm-hmm.
attractive and really pretty creative fonts that make it super hard to read. So get as pretty and as creative as you want with your boat name on your transom, but try to leave the font so that it's super readable because it just does add to an ease of communication here. And
And
I want to, yeah.
the Coast Guard should reinforce that, because there are laws on what the letters should look like, how big they are, and not be fancy,
Mhm.
buried in some graphic.
Yes. So I do want to unpack that a little bit more, back up just a little bit, because you mentioned hand signals, you mentioned horn signaling, and of course we talked about the radio. So kind of walk us through, the order of those procedures. That where would you start as you're approaching another vessel? You're coming up behind another trawler who's going just a little slower than you. Where would you start on those three different methods of contact?
Well, if he doesn't know that I'm behind him, I would call him on the radio by vessel name and ask, I'm behind you, requesting a slow pass. And then they would acknowledge that's fine. They'll slow down a little bit, else maybe speed up or keep the same speed and just go right past him. And then he can speed up again and pull in behind me. That would be the ideal.
Okay.
Uh, the
And if
horn is
mhm.
for the instances where he's not picking up the radio because he's in a sailboat, and sailboats don't typically have the radio right there at the helm. And he's been driving for 6 weeks from Montreal, and he's frozen to death, and he's in a coma driving at 5 knots. And
Mhm.
that's when you need the horn to wake him up, to know that he's in the middle of the channel and you'd like to get by him.
Okay. And one of the things that I believe you talk about on both the hand signals and the horn blasts is the idea of the one and the two horn blast. So can you kind of walk us
Right.
through that a little bit?
Yes, if you do one short burst, it means I'd like to turn to the right and pass you on my port side. And if it's two short blasts, it means I'd like to turn to the left and pass you on my starboard side. And
Okay.
that's whether you're overtaking or passing traffic coming the other way.
Yeah. And for loopers should know that, particularly in the inland rivers, when you're dealing with commercial traffic, the tows will often use, even if you've hailed them on the radio, they will not say, pass me on your starboard. They will say, I'll see you on the one, or I'll see you on the two. So that's an important concept. Great for the intracoastal waterway, but even more important on those inland rivers. And there always seems to be a lot of confusion about the one and the two, and who's port and who's starboard. And the way Bill just described it is spot on and so much simplified. And if you consider it like an analog clock, I'm sure that's an analogy you've used before, Bill, too. But the one means point your bow towards the one on an analog clock, so a little bit to the right. And the two, if you think of the 11 on an analog clock as a Roman numeral two, or two ones, a little bit to the left. And that's all you need to remember. And when I first heard that, I thought that sounds oversimplified, because it had always been explained to me in such a complicated way. And Bill, you just did a great job of really simplifying it, and the clock analogy seems to work. So that's
Well,
a great tip.
it's sort of like port and starboard. Port is a red wine, so it's a red light. And I've always thought, I would like to say that I would recommend, especially if it's a husband and wife and they're not both quite as experienced, make a label and put it on the helm of these rules, so that you just, in case you have a blonde moment or whatever, you just look and make sure, oh yeah, okay, I got that again.
Yep. Always good to have those visual cues for any time that you might run into a little bit of confusion. Let's take a quick break, unless there's anything else on the vessel name, anything we've covered so far that there are any lingering questions you think, Bill, anything with the slow pass procedure or with the vessel names on the boats?
I did want to mention radios though.
Yes.
And I can wait if you want to do, we can come back to this.
Go ahead. Let's talk about that.
One thing that I have found very, very helpful and not typical is my last big boat. I installed a second fixed VHF radio on the bridge. So I had two fixed VHF radios. One was on 16 and one was on 13. And I also had a handheld that we left on 68 because we wound up during this trip meeting another couple and we started buddy boating with them. So we'd be listening on 16 as you're supposed to, but 13 allowed us to talk to any of the commercial traffic, especially with AIS. You could call them by name and say, what would you like me to do? And then have this third radio that they're listening and they can talk to me. Hey, did you see that, was it the pink house on the ICW with the giraffe or something? It was some goofy thing that people see along that. So rather than just one radio, I think having multiple radios has proven itself time and again to be very, very worthwhile.
That's a great tip. Expensive. Yeah, that's a great tip, and it's not one that I think I've come across before. I certainly have seen more than one radio at the helm station, but never really thought about the idea of how they were using multiple, and that makes total sense. So thank you. That's a great tip. Let's take a quick break. I'll play a message from one of our sponsors, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about things that you need to know to successfully and safely navigate the ICW. And I think the next thing on the list is bridge clearances. So we'll be back in a moment. Schooner Island Marina is the only full-service floating dock marina on the island in Wildwood, New Jersey, offering ship store, pool, brokerage and new boat sales, gas and diesel, mobile pump out, and a full-service yard for any repair needs. Even better for loopers, you can walk to grocery, convenience stores, shops, and restaurants. Wildwood offers one of the most expansive beaches in South Jersey and the best amusement park rides, all within a 15-minute walk. A short ride up the ICW from Cape May Inlet leads you to our well-protected marina. Visit schoonerislandmarina.com for more info. We are back on Great Loop Radio. My guest today is Bill Parlatore. Bill is filling us in based on an article that he wrote called Getting Ready for the Great Loop. And he's filling us in on, some of the things you need to know, some tips, so to speak, for newer boaters who are taking on the Great Loop. So Bill, let's move on to bridge clearances. Tell us a little bit more about the importance of knowing the height of the bridges and how you find the best information, because it's not always where you might think it would be.
No, it's surprising how few people really know about bridge clearances, but it gets back to what you had said earlier. Not everybody grew up in an area that had bridges. So if you grew up in the Northwest, you have no idea what bridges are. Or if you live in South Florida, you see them all the time. So the idea has come up that the bridge clearance is at the lowest point, which is for a bridge that's over like a drawbridge, it's going to be at the foundation sides, and they should be marked at what the height is, and they usually have they take into account if there's a tidal current. It'll tell you how much water they have, so you don't have to call the bridge. You know whether you can pass under it or not. Now, of course, it's important to know what the height is of your vessel, and for some boats, it's pretty easy to figure that out. If you have a boat deck, like I see over your head, it's kind of flat. So maybe the boat deck above you is just flat versus a ship, kind of a curved shape. You could take something like a fishing pole and lay it on the boat deck and let out fishing line until it hits the water. And then stop it and measure that on the dock to get the exact height to your boat deck. And then you can use a tape measure once you decide what can be laid down and what's left, whether it's a mast or radar or whatever. You can measure the individual components above that and then come up with a pretty darn close clearance that you can feel comfortable with and confident.
So if you don't have that flat deck, is there another method you can suggest for, really figuring out, because you really can't go by the boat's specs, particularly if it's been resold, there may have been some aftermarket features added. So, let's say you don't have that flat deck at the top of the boat. What are some other options for really figuring out what your
if you had like a Nordic tug or something with multiple levels and so forth, you can just measure the pieces carefully, the different heights, and put them together. I recommend don't do that yourself. Have somebody with you and just measure from the waterline up to the bulwark or someplace, and then just go from there up to the top of the cabin. And you can still come up with something that's really, really close. Mm-hmm. I know one guy actually flew his drone behind his boat when he was going under a bridge to see how much space there was. And then he kind of backtracked to figure out what the height was from that by going under the bridge, which is okay. I had never heard of that. But,
that's interesting. I've never heard of that either. Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay, so
it's important to know that. It's important to know that because their bridge attenders don't like to open a bridge unnecessarily. And if they see that you're going to fit and you say, no, you're not going to fit, you need to be really right.
Mm-hmm. So, and with that in mind, tell a little bit more about kind of the impact of tides. So you figured out your air draft on your boat. And let's say you're looking in a cruising guide and you see that the bridge coming up has 20-foot clearance. What does that 20-foot exactly mean, and how sure can you be from the cruising guide that that's actually correct?
If you're coming up to, I wouldn't believe anything that's in the cruising guide because they change. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to keep cruising guides up to date, although I applaud them for trying to do it every year, but it's really difficult. You can't travel blind that way. But when you come up to, say, the municipal bridge in St. Augustine, it very clearly says what the height is, and you can see on the there's a board on the side where the current is going through. It'll show you the numbers of what the height is at that moment. Mm-hmm. And so you'll be able to determine whether or not you can make the bridge. And of course, you'll probably need to lower your antennas because they also don't like to raise bridges because you could have put your antenna down, but you didn't want. So that's kind of an etiquette thing too.
Right. So, certainly don't rely on the cruising guide, particularly in highly tidal areas or if there's been flooding rain or things like that. But it's great for a planning tool, correct? Because I would rather know well before the bridge that, okay, this one might be close.
Yeah. Plus the guide tells you other things that you might want to know, which is kind of off what we're talking here a little bit. But one of the kind of love-hate things I have with the Great Loop is that some people that are just planning to do the loop in 1 year, they'll just go through and not stop anywhere. Right before COVID, I had lunch in Annapolis with 3 couples from the Midwest who were all doing the loop and they weren't traveling together, but they happened to have kind of gotten to be friends. And they were going to do Chesapeake Bay in 2.5 days, which I thought was, that's kind of sad because there's so much to see, but they were, I took one couple to go get their propane tank filled. And so we had some enjoyable lunch, but I was just surprised how people don't maybe use the cruising guide to say, well, let's go to St. Michael's or let's go to Baltimore or any number of places along the loop of actually stop and spend some time. Are you aware of a guy named Dave Pike?
Yes.
He did it in a Walker Bay.
Yes.
He did the loop in a Walker Bay rib.
Yes.
And I caught up with him in Rock Hall and wrote a couple of articles about him.
Yep.
And his way of doing this was he played pickleball every night.
Yes,
He
he
would,
actually just came up in our forum this week because somebody was asking
oh,
about
right.
playing pickleball and how do you know where you can play pickleball? And somebody mentioned Dave Pike.
But he said that every night he got off the boat. Obviously, it was in a 15-foot open boat,
Mm-hmm.
but he would play, and the socialization, it kept him active. And he just said that kept it from being a boring boating trip because he got off the boat every day. And I think maybe that's a little extreme, but I think it's important to maybe travel for a few days and then take a day or two off, maybe.
Yeah. And even for most loopers, even when they do it in kind of that typical seasonal year-long cruise, the average actual days underway is usually 1 in every 3. So, roughly 120 travel days is pretty much kind of the looper average. Now, whether that 120 days is over the course of a year or over the course of 3 years is just dependent on how long you stay in different places. But even in a year, there's plenty of time to explore, and we certainly encourage that. And actually, you mentioned the Chesapeake, and that's one place I think people get a little bit in a hurry for a couple of reasons. I think they can get a little bit overwhelmed because there is so much you could see on the Chesapeake. But the other thing is, I think they start to get eager to get into the New York State canals and get over the border into Canada and do some of the cruising in the Great Lakes. And the Chesapeake is actually one of the places I hear most when there is a looper who has completed the loop and decides they fell in love with the lifestyle, they're keeping the boat, they're going to keep cruising. The Chesapeake is probably the most common cruising ground I hear of them going back to because they feel like they missed so much. So
That's
it's a
good to
great,
hear.
it is, and it's a great place, particularly if you're living, year round on the boat. A lot of people try to leave Florida during hurricane season for insurance reasons, and the Chesapeake has really become quite a magnet for a lot of loopers during the summer who are trying to escape the heat and the hurricane fees that you'll pay on your insurance if you're in Florida during that time. So Bill, we've talked a little bit about, the clearance on those bridges and that the signage that's right there at the bridge is probably the most accurate information you're going to get. So you can know from the cruising guides as you're approaching the bridge if it might be one that's closed for you and whether you have to request an opening. How reliable is it that there will be signage there? Do you find a lot of places in your cruising where maybe the signage has been removed or fallen and not been maintained?
Only in places that most people don't go. That if it's an offshoot or a variation on a traditional route, you might find something that's not either well maintained, or in the case of Lake Okeechobee, there's a certain way of going Lake Okeechobee. We kind of go around, and when you call the bridge tender, he's at home and he says, "Oh, give me a couple minutes, I'll drive down," and then he operates the bridge. So I mean, it's the bridges are all kind of different, and I think that. You generally don't have this scratching your head, I don't know what to do here, because you can always call them either cell phone or on the radio and
Right.
and get information that way.
Okay. And that was actually my next question. How, from your experience in the extended cruising you've done, how willing are those bridge tenders to answer a VHF call or answer a phone call, which you can also find that information in the cruising guide. So that's another reason to have it with you. But how willing are they to give you, if you're a mile out and you might have a substantial equipment you may have to drop or whatever it might be, are they usually willing to give you the current height if you call them ahead of time?
I have found them ranging from super accommodating to much less so. The the Roosevelt Bridge in Stewart, that lady is. I always thought about sending her roses because she's just always so happy, and
Mhm.
she wants to know where you're coming from. And then the opposite is when you're going through Norfolk or going up the Carolinas, where those 3 bridges are, where they're not as particularly as interested in knowing anything about you. But this got into a discussion I had with a friend of mine who was helping me my boat up when we went to Norfolk. There was the question of, do you slow your boat down to time arriving at the hour or half hour or whatever, or do you just hurry up and get there and then wait? And he said, no, let's get up there and wait. And I normally would disagree with them, but in Norfolk, it turned out they were working on the bridge. And she said, I'm going to open it 20 minutes early just for you, because that'll give them more time to work on the bridge. So by showing up 20 minutes early, she just let us through, which is not something you expect to see. but I thought that was sort of changed your attitude a little bit to not slow down, but to get there and see what's going on.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting because a lot of loopers would prefer to slow down to time it for the bridge opening rather than just, get there and have the hassle of trying to do donuts for 20 minutes until the
Right.
bridge opens. So that's an interesting anecdote about how sometimes actually continuing at your normal speed can work in your favor. So that's a great tip.
That's
Anything
only
else?
happened once, though.
Yeah. So unlikely, but could be in your favor every now and then. So before we wrap up, Bill, any other, tips along these lines that you would want newer boaters to know about before they set out on their great loop?
I think it's really important to set an example and to make sure that you don't do disservice to your boat or your crew by being rude or anything, because when you're traveling in places like Dismal Swamp or the ICW or the Erie Canal, any of the canals, you're going to see these people again. So if you think you're going to blast, these delivery captains that throw a huge wake and then fly by you at 40 knots, you're never going to see them again. But these looper people, you're going to keep running into them. So you kind of want to make friends with them.
That is 100% true. And I also, I am distressed by what I call wake shaming, but there have been some instances where the Great Loop, a Facebook group called The Great Loop, which is AGLCA's Facebook group, has grown to over 50,000 people. Now, there are not anywhere near 50,000 people in the association. It's a public group. Many of the people in there are not loopers. So anything that happens there, I try to take with a grain of salt. But there have been a few instances where somebody, calls out another for waking them on not giving them a slow pass, and the burgee's flying, and they post the boat name and everything else, and it never ends well for anybody. I don't think that makes any of us look good. I started calling it public wake shaming, and we tend to remove them on Facebook, not because we're taking one side or the other. There are certain people who say that they've gotten this wake and maybe it wasn't as substantial, who knows, but just do a slow pass and then none of us have to worry about it, especially if you're flying that burgee. As Bill said, make yourself and your crew and your boat look good, but also for the association's sake. I've said it a couple times now, but I just cringe when I get these reports of somebody flying the burgee and, not following proper boating etiquette. So, Bill, great advice today. I think it's really going to be helpful for some of our newer boaters. And as I said, there will be a link to the article Bill wrote in the video description and in the audio description for the podcast. So, Bill Parlatore, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really insightful.
My pleasure. Have
And
a great time, Deborah.
Yeah. And to everyone who's watched or listened today, thank you for joining us once again. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.